Welcome back. More now on our top story, and we're going to devote the rest of the hour to the Chancellor's financial plans and how they affect you. We've been asking for your questions today, and our panel is here to help answer some of them. Joining me is Zoe Billingham, the director of the IPPR North think tank, Lord Jim O'Neill, former Treasury Minister and former Chief Economist at Goldman Sachs. And here with me in the studio is Andy Mayer, CEO, COO and Energy Analyst at the Institute of Economic Affairs. A very good evening to all of you. Thank you very much for your time. Perhaps, first of all, I'll get you all in one sentence to sum up your thoughts on today's mini-budget. Andy, why don't you start?
So the government is obsessed with growth and has delivered a growth plan. They've done it in the right way. They're lowering taxes and they're starting the process of supply-side reform, which means getting out of the way so companies, businesses and individuals can focus on growth. OK,
that was a very good sentence. Lord O'Neill, same to you.
Most remarkable budget I've ever lived through, even though it's not supposed to be a budget. A generous person might call it audacious. I've been thinking that on and off all day, but I can think of plenty of other phrases, including potentially reckless, as you can see how the financial markets are behaving as we speak. OK, and Zoe?
So today's budget was deeply problematic, both for those of us who care about inequality, but it should also be problematic for those who care about economic growth. Now, I care about both of those things, and so it leaves me with a bad taste in my mouth from today's budget. OK, so that's all of your takes on what we heard earlier. Let's go to some of the questions, shall we? Starting with one from Jay. He asks, why has the government chosen to reduce tax more for the higher earners than for those on lower incomes? Lord O'Neill, perhaps you could kick things off for us.
I don't know. Linked to what I said initially, the scale of fiscal stimulus in itself that the government has decided to do all in one shot, at the time when the issues about inflation are around, and crucially, many concerns in global markets, particularly led by the US, it's almost like they haven't thought about the fact that we're not living in our own isolated world. I think it's politically, obviously, a very risky thing for them to have done. And it's very much against the spirit of so-called levelling up, which they were both, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor were seemingly contented members of the government that seemingly was so committed to that.
But Andy, in effect, all workers do benefit, don't they, from this budget?
Yeah, and it's not the test. The test on the high-profile tax cuts, which may or may not benefit the wealthy more than others, is should they be there in the first place? The government isn't setting out to increase inequality. It's looking at the whole picture and saying, if we do these things, in the long term, it will mean more growth and we're all richer. And some of this is a bit hypocritical. So when the national insurance rises came in, they were attacked from the left as being an assault on working people and an assault on the levelling up agenda. And now that that's been cancelled, it's all about the rich, apparently. So I think those on the left need to make up their minds. Are they going to welcome the parts of the package that do make sense while retaining their criticism for those bits that don't?
Zoe, your thoughts?
So I think when we look at the overall package of tax cuts today, we see that it's deeply regressive. So that means that the wealthier you are, the more you benefit from this package. So I would say this goes hand in hand with economic growth, because actually what we're seeing today is a reversion to trickle-down economics, where you believe making rich people richer will simply trickle down and benefit everybody else. Well, that model has been shown to have failed. Even the International Monetary Fund no longer hold on to trickle-down economics as the right economic model. So I think if you care about growth, but if you also care about inequality, the budget today was deeply troubling on both counts.
OK, well, let's stick with trickle-down economics then, because Stewie has asked about that. He says, are they proven to work? From what I can see, this budget does nothing for the average hard-working family. Zoe has pretty much answered that question already, so let's get the thoughts of Andy on that.
Well, Trickle-down economics is a 130-year-old slur by a Democratic Party presidential candidate in a long-gone election. It's never been the policy of any administration, British or American. And it is simply an idea that the whole way politics and economics works is around redistribution, which is not the point of this budget. The point of this budget is supply-side reform, which is about getting regulations out of the way when the government has been interfering in markets and ensuring that people can invest money in infrastructure, in new industries, in ensuring that our energy challenge can be solved. So it's just irrelevant, frankly. It's going to dominate the debate because the lingo is great. It's a really brilliant piece of jargon, but it doesn't mean anything.
OK. Jim, is Stewie right when he says that this mini-budget has nothing for the average hard-working family?
It's not got as much for the average hard-working family as for the wealthy because of the nature of the tax cuts. But linked to my tone, it's got something for everyone. It's a huge fiscal stimulus, as I think I heard the IFS say. It's probably the biggest net fiscal stimulus since the famous 1972 budget. And I know Andy is trying to put it all in political terms, but I'm independent of either political party. I see it as an independent member of the Lords and an economist, and at a minimum, it's very risky. In order for this to work, lots of things have to not go wrong, and the only thing that's happened today, and the financial markets in New York are still open, and I've spent getting on for 35 years. Deeply involved in them, and the markets are sending messages that they are quite bothered by what has happened today. You've had an enormous rise in gilt yields on a daily basis point, nearly 50 basis points, and as of 5 minutes ago, before we started, a 3.5% drop in sterling. And if we have another couple of days about that, to be honest, I think some people advising the Prime Minister and the Chancellor might be suggesting, you know what, you might have to rein back on some of the things that are happening, because the Bank of England will have to consider raising rates even more aggressively than they might have done 24 hours ago again. And so the consumers are going to, anybody that borrows, are going to get hurt by all of that as well. So,
yeah, and you mentioned that. You mentioned the
the supply side reforms that Andy talks about, in principle, are exactly what the country needs to boost its productivity rate. But you do not combine that at the same time with a ginormous fiscal stimulus just after you've announced an enormous package to support everybody through the energy crisis, when everybody's freaking out about inflation. It is just extremely risky.
OK, yeah, and they took that risk in 1972, as you mentioned, and it didn't pay off then.
No.
Let's go to this question from Max, pretty short and sweet, really. Does this budget have the potential to bankrupt the UK, Zoe?
Well, certainly the measures taken today, tax cut measures, are using up the fiscal space we have left, and that means the amount of additional debt we can take on as a country. As Jim has said, the markets have responded very negatively to this news, with the pound almost now on a par with the dollar. So that's a bad sign. So I would say using up your fiscal space at this time gives no room for manoeuvre later, when the government will still need to help and support those at the lowest end of the spectrum and who will still face significant energy price rises this winter.
Andy, as Max was saying, is bankrupt in the UK possible, or will growth, as the government hopes, pay these bills?
No, we're not going to be doing anything like that. And the market correction in the currencies is important and significant. I agree the market reaction has been poor, but it is not a catastrophe, and it is the immediate reaction. Let's see what actually happens over the next few weeks.
OK, all right. Plenty more questions after the break. Don't go away.
I'm Hannah Thomas-Peter, and I'm Sky's climate change correspondent. The UK is a world leader in wind power. Power! Power! People! It's part of the Congo Basin rainforest, which is such an important ecosystem. It's known as the lungs of Africa. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. She doesn't really enjoy speaking to the press, and it wasn't clear right up until the last moment that she was going to sit down with me.
I might be just very naive, but I do believe that change is possible, otherwise we wouldn't be climate activists.
I'm confident for the last 30 years we have known how bad it is. I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to fight for the next step.
You can see just the piles and piles of stuff, these sofas and people's desks and children's books. And you can see inside this home here, people trying to sort out their home. It's just been devastating.
I think everything's at stake. The future of our planet, the future of the beauty around us, the future of you and me.
Welcome back to Sky News Tonight. Straight back to your questions on today's mini budget with our expert panel. Michael has been in touch. How long before we start seeing the growth that this plan is supposed to elicit? Will it be instant or will it take years? What do you reckon, Jim?
Well, as I keep referring to, a lot of things aren't directly under the control of those who've made these decisions. We live in a global financial market, and if we see many days of what we've seen today, and hopefully we won't, but if we do, and having been in them, once these things start, they don't just sort of magically stop, it's going to cause problems. A facetious person would say, if it carries on like this, the so-called November budget might have to be an emergency budget the other way, because it is a pretty dramatic move we've seen today by any of the standards that I've lived through to do with UK budgets.
Yeah, I mean,
and so it's quite serious, and that will mean that the consequences for the real economy, despite the intention of the government, will be worse. So eventually something will happen and we'll get more growth, but the way this has all been done together, and the reason why I used audacious is there are bits of it that I sort of vaguely try to admire, but it just so much all thrown together.
But you could argue, couldn't you?
It's quite mesmerising.
Yeah, you could argue that is the only solution, given the dire situation, Zoe, that the country finds itself in. Maybe the only solution is to throw the kitchen sink at it.
Well, I absolutely agree that we need large-scale intervention, but of course it's totally at the government's choice of how to do that, who benefits and where benefits. So in response to your question, this is very much a sugar rush budget. I mean, the collection of measures are epic proportion. They go to the wrong places, but of course, in the short term, I imagine there will be a short spike of economic activity. The stamp duty cut, for instance, might stimulate some more activity in the housing market, but that's not what's needed. So we might see a short spike in growth, but I don't think anything has changed in the fundamentals of our economy for the longer term. For the longer term, we need proper investment. I mean, there are much better reasons to invest in the UK than tax cuts. I think it's actually quite a pessimistic narrative that we hear today, that the only reason that businesses want to do business in the UK is if we do a race to the bottom on all fronts, on all taxes. I actually think there's a much more positive story to tell about what we can offer business in the UK. And I think an investment story on skills, on health, would be a far stronger one than the one we've seen today from budget.
OK. And Andy, your thoughts on growth? It's all about getting the country growing again, getting the economy growing again, giving them that sort of injection. But will it take 1 year, 2 years, 5 years?
Yes, so some of the effects will be immediate, and I think Zoe picked up on one of the most effective, which is stimulating the housing market, but she's also absolutely right. If the government don't engage in serious planning reform and not just in the investment zones, then that won't happen. It will just push up house prices, which again will price young people out of the market. So it's got to be both. In the longer term, what we will see is some of these tax effects stimulating investment now or investment plans, which could then kick in 3, 5, 10 years. Energy is a great example. Nothing in energy gets done quickly. So what we want to see is people showing that confidence again that the government's made the right calls there. But for that, more supply-side reform is needed.
OK. Got quite a specific question from Tony regarding his personal situation. He says, I earn more than £50,000 a year and nowhere near £100,000. Those earning ridiculous amounts of money have just been given a 5% bonus. Is that fair, says Tony? I have a feeling, Zoe, I know what you might say to this.
Well, according to analysis out today, those earning under £155,000 will not benefit from the tax cuts today. Those over £155,000 will. And indeed, those earning over £1 million will see a tax cut of £40,000. So I will leave that on the table for people to decide for themselves. But I know that that will drive inequality even further apart in this country. That's something I don't want to see. And that's something that will also, in turn, have a drag on economic growth.
Jim?
Listen, I wish there would be none of the fiscal stimulus or tax cuts. And of course, as you've just heard, by definition, it is helping all the wealthier people much more than the others. And it's almost as though they deliberately want to make a song and dance out of that, which frankly seems a bit odd. But what it should have been is a focus on really concentrating on doing things to boost our productivity, which does involve skills and education and proper investments and incentives for real risk-taking, as opposed to this never-ending nonsense about some small change in corporate tax, supposedly leading to some miraculous boost in investment, which has been tried and tried again the past 20 years. And we have one of the lowest investment rates in the G20. And it is really quite scary that this scale of fiscal risk is taken at a time where we have the lowest unemployment rate for 50 years. And whilst a lot of our inflation is coming from energy prices, as the markets are demonstrating, as I say again, as we speak, this is a sign that the markets are actually more worried about inflation now because of what's been announced today. And therefore, it's sort of defeating some of what the true, probably underlying genuine long-term purpose, which Andy has touched on a bit, which is to really raise the country's growth potential. But you do not do that by giving mammoth tax cuts when the economy is so close to such challenges with wages and full employment.
OK. Do you agree with that, Andy? Do you think there was nothing there to help investment, to help training, to help the workforce earn more and get out there? I mean, that's what Kwasi Kwarteng was saying, wasn't he? That there are incentives now for people to work more, work harder and boost productivity.
Yeah, and I think that is work in progress. This is a mini budget, not the full picture. And let's remember, this government has been in place for around about a month, most of which has been taken up by a national tragedy. So they haven't had very much time. And what they're trying to do is send a signal of what's to come. But to go back to the original question, I don't think it's a heroic injustice that we've restored the top rate of tax that existed for the entirety of the Labour government that was last in, bar the last year where they introduced the 50p rate purely as a poison pill and an election stunt to harm the Tories.
OK. Great getting your thoughts. Thank you very much for answering those questions. Apologies if we didn't get round to yours. Andy Mayer, CEO at the Institute of Economic Affairs, thank you. Lord Jim O'Neill, former Treasury Minister and former Chief Economist at Goldman Sachs. Good to get your thoughts. And also Zoe Billingham, Director of the IPPR North think tank. Really good to get your say and hear what you have to say about today's mini-budget. Thank you all. Do stay with us here on Sky News Tonight. Coming up in the next hour, the pound plunges following today's major announcements from the new Chancellor. We'll have all the latest reaction and analysis at the top of the hour.
There are now 2 billion people shopping on laptops and phones 24 hours in every zone. If you do business online, no need to do it alone. We'll help you keep up with the clicks.
It's 8 o'clock. This is Sky News Tonight. Our top story, one of the biggest economic interventions by a UK government.
We promised a new approach for a new era. We promised to release the enormous potential of this country. Our growth plan has delivered all those promises and more.
The Chancellor announces a raft of tax cuts and increases borrowing by billions, sending the value of the pound plummeting. But there are some celebrations in the city after the Chancellor scraps the cap on bankers' bonuses and a further boost for top earners. Coming up, we'll look at how the financial markets have reacted and what the changes mean to households and businesses. Also tonight, voting gets underway in referenda in Moscow-controlled areas of Ukraine. Western nations call the votes a sham. We report from a newly liberated village in Kherson, just a few miles from the Russian-occupied region, as some residents start to return home. Almost impossible to watch, the Instagram clips viewed by Molly Russell are shown at the inquest into her death.